Welcome to DIY Easy Crafts and BergKnifeMaking.com. Today we're going to take a look at how to cast hybrid knife scales without a pressure pot and without any bubbles in the finished casting. So this is the nautical themed knife that I'm working on, and I wanted to make my own cast knife handles. I've not really done this too often with epoxy. I did it a couple years back with a pressure pot, but I wanted to do a video showing that it can be done without a pressure pot and without a vacuum chamber. So I started out with some dyed wood burl. This is already stabilized. I have a separate video on stabilizing wood. I cleaned it off with a wire brush just to make sure there wasn't any sawdust or any debris on it. And I also warmed that wood. Whenever you're going to cast an object, you really want to warm it up a little bit. I used mold release in the plastic container that I used as the mold. The plastic container is just a storage container I found down at Michael's Art Supply, and that did not work out well. The epoxy actually stuck to it. The epoxy that I'm going to use is from Totalboat. It's called their Thick Set epoxy, and it's really nice because it's very thin, which allows bubbles to raise to the surface very quickly and easily, and it has a very long set time. 24 hours. So basically that gives a lot of time for any bubbles in the mix to reach the surface and therefore not be in your casting. You do have to mix it slowly so that you don't add too many bubbles into the mixture. I then added a little bit of blue dye, and it comes in either liquid or powder. I happen to like the powder. And you continuously mix that. I mix the epoxy for almost 5 minutes, scraping the sides, scraping the bottom. And then you want to, once it's all mixed, you want to pour it in from one side and kind of let it flow through the rest of the mold. So really the tricks to getting a bubble-free casting with epoxy is to pick an epoxy like this Totalboat Thick Set epoxy that's very thin and has a very long set time. The next layer of epoxy that I put on was a little bit more transparent, and I'm really just playing around. It's kind of a learning curve. I wanted to have different colors or different shades of the blue in there. And then the last, I dribbled a little of a very darker blue. What's also nice about this Totalboat Thick Set epoxy, because it has that long working time, you really have a decent amount of time to play around before it starts to set on you. Now, bubbles, when they do reach the surface, you can certainly pop them. You can do it with a knife or a pin, or you can use just one of those little butane lighters that would pop them. For me, and knife scales, it really doesn't matter because I'm going to sand this block. So the top of that casting is not the finish, it's not going to be the end result finish that's going to be on the knife handles. Now, because I had never worked with this before, I did sand off just one side and polished it up just a little bit. I sanded it down to 600 grit and then put it on the buffing wheel for a couple minutes just to see how it was going to look. And I have to say I was quite impressed. It was a very easy product to work with. There's absolutely no micro bubbles deep into the casting as far as I can see. It's adhered beautifully to this stabilized and dyed wood burl. So the next step for me, this cast was a little bit too thick for knife handles. I ran over to my friend Jason Northgard's shop, and on his table saw he was able to slice that into two pieces that were about 3/8 thick. And he's using a zero tolerance board underneath so that small piece won't get sucked down into the table saw. So after it's cut, you end up with basically two pieces that are approximately the right thickness. And these are now scale material that I can utilize on my knife project. Now, I did glue blue liners onto the back, And then I shape them and attach them to the knife just like I would any other scales, with epoxy and also with, in this case, stainless steel pins. I then went over to my 2x72 belt grinder and I finished profiling the shape of the handles, or the shape of the scales. I try to do as much as I possibly can on that 2x72. I'm able to shape the inside of the handles just by letting that belt hang over a little bit on the right, off the right side of the flat platen. And then I actually start to shape the handles, or to curve that upper edge of the handles right on the 2x72. You have to be real careful not to touch the blade to the belt at all. You very easily ruin a project at this point. I do a lot of these deeply etched, they're electro-etched, themed blades. I've always been into the nautical end of it. So if anybody's interested in these nautical blades, you can always check out my site, which is www.bergknifemaking.com. I'm just shaping the inside edge there. And then I'll take this over and use an oscillating sander. And I'll sand with 220, 400, 600, and 1000. And then I finished it off with a little bit of hand sanding with that 1000 grit. After the hand sanding, I went to a buffing wheel, and I buffed it with a little bit of compound, very light touch on the buffing wheel. It wasn't really pushing very hard, and it didn't take long. Polished right up. I forgot to mention before, the Totalboat Thick Set Epoxy, you really have to wait about a week after pouring it for it to be totally cured. So you probably don't really want to polish it until almost 5 to 7 days after pouring it. But this is the finished product. And to say the least, I was very, very pleased and very impressed by it. So this is a nautical shark and shipwreck themed knife with hybrid handles made from a dyed and stabilized wood burl and Totalboat Thick Set Epoxy. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up, and I'd love it if you took a minute and just left a comment in the comment section. By all means, check us out on the site I mentioned before, bergknifemaking.com. Join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. And if you're interested in learning how to make your own knives, Jason Northgard and I put out a book last year called Introduction to Knife Making, and that can be found on Amazon.com. Thank you very much.